The pristine white fence posts gleamed in the afternoon sun as Margaret Thornfield marched across private property like she owned the world, until the honking started. Behind her, 3 perfectly manicured HOA board members clutched their clipboards, oblivious to the territorial fury awakening in the tall grass. What they didn't know was that retired Marine Corps veteran Jake Morrison had been watching from his kitchen window, and his 6 Canadian geese weren't just pets. They were his personal security force, trained to defend their territory with military precision. Margaret was about to discover Jake Morrison set down his morning coffee and watched through the kitchen window as 4 figures marched across his property line like they owned the place. The woman leading the charge wore a crisp white blazer and carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that screamed middle management. Behind her, 3 others followed in formation, each clutching identical clipboards against their chests like shields. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake muttered, recognizing the lead trespasser immediately. Margaret Thornfield, president of the Willowbrook Heights HOA, the same woman who'd been sending him increasingly hostile letters for the past 6 months about his non-compliant landscaping and unauthorized structures. The problem was simple. Jake didn't live in her HOA. His 10-acre spread sat outside the subdivision boundaries, a fact he'd verified 3 times with the county clerk after Margaret's first nasty gram arrived. But that hadn't stopped her from treating his property like her personal kingdom, complete with surprise inspections and demands that he conform to neighborhood standards that didn't legally apply to him. Jake pulled on his boots and stepped onto the back porch, his weathered hands gripping the railing. At 62, the retired Marine still carried himself like the staff sergeant he'd once been, broad shoulders squared, steel-gray eyes alert, every movement deliberate. 24 years in the Corps had taught him to assess threats quickly, and right now, Margaret Thornfield was marching straight toward his biggest headache, his chicken coop. The structure sat about 200 yards from the house, a modest building he'd constructed himself using salvaged barnwood and corrugated metal roofing. It housed 16 hens and 1 very territorial rooster named Sergeant Major. More importantly, it provided the eggs that supplemented his disability pension and gave him something productive to do with hands that hadn't quite figured out civilian life. Margaret's heels clicked across the gravel driveway as she approached the coop, her clipboard army trailing behind. Jake could see her lips moving animatedly as she pointed and gestured, no doubt cataloging every perceived violation of standards that didn't apply to his property. "This is a problem," he said to himself, then cupped his hands around his mouth. "You're on private property." Margaret either didn't hear him or chose to ignore the warning. She continued her unauthorized inspection, now crouching to examine the coop's foundation while one of her followers took photographs. Jake's jaw tightened. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him about boundaries and the consequences of crossing them uninvited. He'd tried being reasonable with Margaret, polite letters explaining property lines, phone calls that went straight to voicemail, even a face-to-face conversation at the hardware store that ended with her walking away mid-sentence. But this was different. This was his land, his sanctuary, the one place where HOA politics and suburban power games were supposed to stop at the fence line. He walked down the porch steps and across the yard, his boots crunching on autumn leaves. As he got closer, he could hear Margaret's voice carrying on the crisp October air. "Completely out of compliance with architectural guidelines. The roofing material alone is a violation of Section 12.3, and don't get me started on the color scheme." "Mrs. Thornfield." Jake's voice cut through her monologue like a drill sergeant calling formation. "You need to leave." Margaret straightened and turned, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the sunlight. At 54, she maintained the appearance of someone who'd never worked a day of manual labor in her life. Manicured nails, spotless clothing, skin that spoke of expensive dermatology appointments. Her blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence and implied threats. "Mr. Morrison," she smiled with all the warmth of a tax audit, "I was just conducting a routine compliance inspection on property that's not part of your HOA. According to our records, according to the county clerk, my property line ends 50 feet behind where you're standing." Jake gestured toward the wooden fence posts that clearly marked the boundary between his land and the subdivision. "You want to inspect something, inspect the other side of that fence." Margaret's smile never wavered, but Jake caught the flash of irritation in her eyes. Behind her, the 3 board members shifted nervously. A middle-aged man with a comb-over, a woman in her 40s wearing too much jewelry, and a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Morrison, I think there's been some confusion about the property boundaries. Our HOA attorney has reviewed the plat maps, and we believe whatever you want. Legal surveys don't care about your beliefs." Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone that had once made privates snap to attention. "What they care about is that you're trespassing." The jewelry woman whispered something to comb-over man, who nodded and scribbled on his clipboard. Margaret noticed the exchange and seemed to draw strength from their presence. "I understand you might be confused about the community standards that apply here," she said, her voice taking on a patronizing edge that made Jake's teeth clench. "But even properties adjacent to our development have certain responsibilities to maintain appropriate appearance standards. Lady, the only responsibility I have is to keep trespassers off my land. Now there's no need for hostility." "Hostility?" Jake barked out a laugh that held no humor. "You want to see hostility? Keep standing on my property uninvited and you'll get a real good look at it." The younger board member tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "Maybe we should finish our inspection," Margaret cut him off, then turned back to Jake with renewed determination. "Mr. Morrison, your structure here is visible from multiple homes in our community. The Architectural Review Committee has received numerous complaints about its appearance and the noise from your chickens. Then tell your committee to stop looking over the fence. We have a responsibility to our homeowners to maintain property values and community standards. I'm sure you can understand that." Jake understood perfectly. He understood that Margaret Thornfield was the kind of person who'd spent her whole life telling other people what to do, backed by committees and bylaws, and the assumption that everyone should bow to her particular version of suburban perfection. He understood that she saw his chickens and his weathered coop as personal affronts to her authority. What she didn't understand was that Jake Morrison had spent 2 decades taking orders, and his order-taking days were over. "Here's what I understand," he said, stepping close enough that Margaret had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "You're standing on private property without permission. You're taking photographs of my structures without consent, and you're threatening me with legal action based on authority you don't have." Margaret's composure cracked slightly, but she held her ground. "I'm simply trying to resolve this matter before it becomes unpleasant." "Too late for that." Jake pulled his phone from his back pocket. "Sheriff's Department handles trespassing, complaints. Want to stick around and explain your property law theories to Deputy Collins?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Margaret's face. She glanced at her board members, who were now looking decidedly uncomfortable with the situation they'd volunteered for. "There's no need to involve law enforcement," the jewelry woman said quickly. "We're just trying to be good neighbors." "Good neighbors respect property lines." Margaret straightened her blazer and lifted her chin, the gesture of someone reasserting control over a situation that was slipping away from her. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that we've been very patient with your non-compliance issues, but our patience isn't unlimited. Neither is mine. We have legal options available to us: environmental complaints, county code enforcement, nuisance ordinances. Bring it." Jake's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd faced much worse threats than suburban bureaucrats. "But bring it from the other side of my fence line." Margaret's jaw tightened, and for a moment Jake saw past the HOA president facade to something harder underneath, the kind of person who'd spent years getting her way through intimidation, and the assumption that most people would back down rather than fight. She'd picked the wrong veteran to intimidate. "This conversation isn't over," she said, turning toward the fence line with her clipboard army in tow. "Yes, it is." Margaret paused at the property boundary and looked back, her expression promising future complications. "You know, Mr. Morrison, there are ways to make life very difficult for people who won't cooperate with community standards. I'd hate to see you learn that the hard way." Jake watched them disappear through the gate that led back into Will. Jake rolled over in bed and squinted at the caller ID. Willowbrook County Clerk. He let it go to voicemail, but before he could drift back to sleep, it rang again. Same number. By the third call, he gave up on sleep entirely. "Morrison?" he answered, his voice rough with sleep and irritation. "Mr. Morrison, this is Patricia Hendricks from the county clerk's office. I'm calling about a complaint we received regarding structures on your property that may not be in compliance with county building codes." Jake sat up, suddenly wide awake. "What kind of complaint?" "The complaint alleges that you've constructed buildings without proper permits, specifically a chicken coop and a pond that may violate setback requirements and environmental regulations. That's interesting, considering I pulled permits for both those projects 3 years ago." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, our records don't show any permits filed under your name for the past 5 years. Jake's blood went cold. He'd personally walked those permit applications into the county office, had waited 2 weeks for approval, and had kept copies of everything in a filing cabinet in his home office. "Ma'am, I'm looking at the permits right now. Permit numbers CC 2021-3847 for the chicken coop and EP 2021-0923 for the pond excavation." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Morrison, I'm showing both those permit numbers as canceled. The notation says they were revoked due to incomplete environmental impact assessments. Revoked when? Yesterday at 4:32 p.m. Exactly 2 hours after Margaret Thornfield had left his property covered in mud and goose droppings. Jake was fully awake now, his mind clicking through the implications with military precision. "Who requested the revocation?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics, but the request came through proper channels with supporting documentation about environmental concerns and potential impact on adjacent properties." "Let me guess. Those adjacent properties happen to be part of the Willowbrook Heights HOA?" The silence on the other end told him everything he needed to know. "Mr. Morrison, you'll need to appear at the county office by Friday to address these compliance issues. If the structures remain without proper permits, we'll have to issue citations and potentially order their removal." Jake hung up and stared at the ceiling for a full minute, processing what had just happened. Margaret hadn't just threatened legal action. She'd already launched it, using connections and bureaucratic manipulation to retroactively invalidate permits he'd obtained legally 3 years ago. It was a masterful first strike, perfectly timed and professionally executed. It was also a declaration that this fight would be conducted entirely outside the bounds of fair play or common decency. Jake Morrison had dealt with worse enemies in worse circumstances, but he'd never fought one with access to county bureaucracy and the kind of political connections that could make legal permits disappear overnight. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number again. Compliance inspection scheduled for your property at 10 a.m. today. County code enforcement, environmental protection, and animal control. Failure to cooperate will result in additional citations." Jake stared at the message, then forwarded it to his lawyer. a former JAG officer named Sarah Chen who specialized in property rights cases. His phone rang 30 seconds later. "Jake, what the hell did you do?" "Told some HOA president to get off my property." With attack geese, apparently. The story's already making rounds at the courthouse. They weren't attack geese. They were just protecting their territory. Well, your territorial protection just triggered the most coordinated, bureaucratic assault I've seen in 15 years of property law. They're coming at you from 6 different angles: building codes, environmental compliance, animal control, noise ordinances, and something called agricultural misuse of residential property. Jake felt his jaw tighten. How is that even possible? Someone with serious connections and a very good understanding of how county bureaucracy works. Jake, whoever you pissed off has friends in multiple departments. This isn't random harassment. It's a coordinated campaign. Through his kitchen window, Jake could see a county van pulling into his driveway, followed by 2 more vehicles with official logos. The inspection team had arrived early, probably hoping to catch him off guard. "Sarah, I need you here. Now." "Already on my way. Don't let them on your property without a warrant, and don't answer any questions without me present." Jake hung up and watched 5 officials in matching polo shirts pile out of the vehicles, each carrying clipboards, measuring devices, and cameras. Leading the group was a thin man in his 40s, with the officious bearing of someone who'd spent his career finding reasons to say no to people. The thin man knocked on the front door with the kind of authoritative rap that suggested he expected immediate compliance. Jake opened it but didn't invite them in. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Inspector Williams from County Code Enforcement. We're here to conduct a compliance inspection of structures on your property. I'll need to see warrants." Williams produced a folded document from his shirt pocket. "Administrative search warrant, signed by Judge Martinez this morning. We have authority to inspect and photograph all structures, improvements, and agricultural operations on this property." Jake scanned the warrant, noting that it was surprisingly comprehensive for something issued on less than 24 hours' notice. Someone had done their homework and called in serious favors to expedite the paperwork. "My attorney is en route," Jake said. "You can wait until she arrives." "Sir, we have a legal right to proceed with this inspection. Delaying or obstructing our investigation could result in additional charges." Behind Williams, the other inspectors were already moving toward the chicken coop, their cameras and measuring devices at the ready. Jake recognized the coordinated efficiency of a well-planned operation. These people knew exactly what they were looking for and had come prepared to find it. His phone rang. Sarah Chen. "Jake, they just faxed me a copy of the search warrant. It's legitimate but way too broad for a routine code inspection. Someone with serious pull expedited this through the system. They're already heading for the coop. Let them proceed, but document everything. Take photos, record conversations if you can, and don't volunteer any information. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Jake pocketed the phone and followed the inspection team across his property, staying close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid accusations of interference. The lead inspector was photographing every detail of the chicken coop, while another measured distances from the structure to his property lines. "Setback violation," one of them announced, making notes on his clipboard. "Structure is only 12 feet from the rear property line. County code requires 15 feet minimum for agricultural buildings." Jake bit back his response. The coop was exactly where the county had approved it 3 years ago, built according to plans that had been reviewed and stamped by these same bureaucrats. But arguing the point now would only give them ammunition for obstruction charges. At the pond, the environmental inspector was taking water samples and photographing the small dock Jake had built for fishing. The dock was a simple structure, 8 pressure-treated posts supporting a platform of marine-grade plywood, but the inspector was documenting it like evidence of environmental terrorism. Unpermitted structure affecting wetland areas, the environmental guy called out. Potential contamination of groundwater and disruption of natural drainage patterns. "That's not a wetland," Jake said despite himself. "I dug that pond 3 years ago on completely dry ground." Williams looked up from his notes. "Sir, any excavated area that collects water is considered a potential wetland under current environmental protection guidelines. Modifications to such areas require extensive environmental impact studies." Jake stared at him in disbelief. "You're calling a farm pond I dug with my own tractor a wetland?" "I'm documenting violations of county environmental codes. The classification will be determined by the Environmental Protection Office." Near the gate that separated his property from Willowbrook Heights, Jake noticed a familiar figure watching the proceedings. Margaret Thornfield stood just inside the subdivision, no longer wearing her mud-stained blazer, but maintaining the same rigid posture of someone accustomed to getting her way. She wasn't alone. 3 other people stood with her, a man in an expensive suit who looked like a lawyer, a woman taking photographs of the inspection, and someone Jake didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested law enforcement. Margaret caught his eye and smiled with the satisfaction of someone watching a carefully planned operation unfold exactly as intended. A pickup truck bounced down the gravel driveway, and Sarah Chen climbed out wearing jeans and a work shirt. That suggested she'd dropped everything to respond to his call. At 45, Sarah carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years fighting bureaucratic battles on behalf of property owners who'd been caught in the machinery of county government. "Jake," she called out, then addressed Inspector Williams. "I'm Mr. Morrison's attorney. I'd like to review the documentation for this inspection." Williams handed her a thick folder. "Everything's in order, counselor. We're conducting a routine compliance check based on citizen complaints about unpermitted structures." Sarah flipped through the papers, her express. Jake woke at 0500 hours, old habits from 2 decades of military service, and began his counteroffensive with the methodical precision that had once made him the Marines' go-to man for impossible missions. His first stop was the county recorder's office, where a sympathetic clerk named Tom Valdez had worked for 37 years and remembered when government served citizens instead of the other way around. "Jake Morrison," Tom said as he approached the counter, "heard you've been having some trouble with the Thornfield machine." "You could say that." "Tom, I need to see every permit, variance, and exemption filed by the Willowbrook Heights HOA for the past 5 years. Tom's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "Public records request?" "Every damn page." 20 minutes later, Jake sat in his truck with 3 boxes of documentation that would have made any intelligence analyst proud. Margaret and her husband had been busy, very busy, using their political connections to bend county regulations in ways that would have been impossible for ordinary citizens. But more importantly, they'd left a paper trail. Jake's phone rang as he pulled out of the parking lot. Sarah Chen. "I've got news," she said without preamble. "The environmental inspector who declared your pond a wetland, he's been overruled by his supervisor. Apparently someone called in a favor that didn't stick." "Meaning?" "Meaning the environmental citations are being dropped. Someone higher up the food chain decided that calling a farm pond a wetland was going to create bad publicity for the county." Jake felt his first moment of genuine satisfaction in 48 hours. "What about the other violations?" "Still active, but we've got grounds to challenge every one of them. The permit cancellations were procedurally irregular, and I found precedent cases that support your position." "Good, because I've got something that's going to make those challenges a lot more interesting." Jake spent the next 2 hours in his home office, cross-referencing the HOA documents with county building codes and permit records. What he found was a masterclass in political corruption disguised as suburban development. The Willowbrook Heights subdivision had been built with systematic violations of the same codes that Margaret was now using to attack his property. Setback requirements that Jake allegedly violated had been waived for HOA properties. Environmental regulations that threatened His pond had been ignored for the subdivision's decorative water features and storm drainage systems. Most damaging of all, the HOA's community center, a 4,000-square-foot building that hosted Margaret's board meetings, had been constructed entirely without permits, on land that was supposed to remain undeveloped green space according to the original subdivision plan. Jake photographed every relevant document, then made copies and stored them in 3 separate locations. In his experience, evidence had a way of disappearing when powerful people were threatened by it. His phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number that had been harassing him. "Final warning, Mr. Morrison. Remove all non-compliant structures by end of week or face maximum enforcement action." Jake smiled as he forwarded the message to Sarah. Margaret was about to learn that threatening a Marine was like poking a grizzly bear with a stick. It only made the bear more determined to eat you. That afternoon, Jake drove through Willowbrook Heights for the first time since moving to his property 4 years ago. The subdivision was everything he'd expected. Pristine streets with names like Harmony Lane and Serenity Circle, houses that looked like they'd been built from the same 3 architectural plans, and enough HOA regulations posted on street corners to make a prison warden jealous. But Jake wasn't interested in the suburban perfection. He was conducting reconnaissance on enemy territory, looking for weaknesses in Margaret's position. He found them at the community center. The building sat in the middle of what was supposed to be a park, surrounded by parking spaces that had been carved out of protected wetlands. Actual wetlands, not the imaginary ones county inspectors had claimed to find at his pond. The structure itself was massive and clearly commercial in scope, complete with a full kitchen, meeting rooms, and what appeared to be office space for HOA management. Jake parked across the street and began photographing the building and its surroundings, paying particular attention to the storm drainage systems that channeled runoff directly into a creek that fed into the county's main reservoir. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you with something?" Jake turned to find a security guard approaching, a young man in his 20s wearing a uniform that said Willowbrook Heights Community Protection. "Just admiring the architecture," Jake replied calmly. "Are you a resident of the community?" "No." The guard's hand moved to his radio. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to leave. Photography of community facilities by non-residents is prohibited under HOA regulations." "HOA regulations don't apply to public streets." "Sir, please return to your vehicle and exit the community immediately." Jake considered his options. He could argue the point and establish his legal right to photograph buildings visible from public areas. Or he could leave voluntarily and avoid giving Margaret ammunition for harassment charges. The smart tactical choice was retreat, for now. "Have a nice day, officer," Jake said, climbing back into his truck. But as he drove toward the subdivision exit, he made one final stop at the community mailbox area. Every suburban development had them, centralized mail delivery points that served multiple streets and provided perfect vantage points for observing traffic patterns and resident behavior. Jake parked and pretended to check his phone while actually photographing the most interesting discovery of his reconnaissance mission. Margaret Thornfield's house sat directly across from the mail area, its backyard separated from the community center by less than 50 feet. More importantly, her property backed up to the same wetlands that had been paved over for the community center parking lot. The same wetlands that would have required extensive environmental impact studies if anyone other than the HOA had tried to develop them. Jake smiled as he photographed the drainage pipe that channeled runoff from Margaret's driveway directly into the protected creek. County environmental regulations prohibited any modifications to residential drainage that affected natural water flow, regulations that carried hefty fines and potential criminal charges for violations. Margaret had just handed him the weapon he needed to destroy her. That evening, Jake sat in his kitchen with Sarah Chin, spreading out photographs and documents like a battle plan. Sarah's expression grew increasingly amazed as Jake walked her through his discoveries. "My God," she said, staring at a photograph of the community center. "They built that entire structure without permits?" "Not a single one. And look at this." Jake showed her the drainage documentation. The original subdivision plan called for that area to remain undeveloped to protect the creek watershed. They not only developed it, they paved over actual wetlands to create parking. The same kind of wetlands they claim to find at your pond, which weren't wetlands at all, according to the environmental supervisor who overruled his inspector. Sarah laughed, the first genuine amusement Jake had heard from her since this began. Jake, this is enough to shut down half the subdivision and trigger state environmental investigations that could last years. It gets better. Jake pulled out photographs of Margaret's house and the drainage modifications. Every house in that subdivision has modified drainage that violates the same environmental codes they're using against me. They've created a systematic pattern of violations while selectively enforcing regulations against adjacent properties. This isn't just hypocrisy, this is prosecutable fraud. Jake's phone rang. Unknown number, but when he answered, the voice was familiar. Mr. Morrison, this is County Commissioner David Thornfield. I believe you know my wife, Margaret. Jake put the phone on speaker and gestured for Sarah to start recording. Commissioner, I understand there's been some confusion about code compliance on your property. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss a resolution that benefits everyone involved. What kind of resolution? The kind that avoids unnecessary legal complications for all parties. My wife may have been overzealous in her interpretation of community standards. Perhaps we can find a compromise. Jake looked at Sarah, who was shaking her head vigorously. David Thornfield was trying to negotiate from a position he thought was strength, unaware that Jake had just acquired enough evidence to destroy both his wife's HOA and his own political career. Commissioner, I think any discussions should go through my attorney. Of course. But Mr. Morrison, I want you to understand that this situation could escalate in ways that might be uncomfortable for everyone. Sometimes it's better to find solutions before things get out of hand. The threat was subtle but clear. David Thornfield was offering to call off his wife's bureaucratic assault in exchange for Jake's cooperation with their vision of community standards. It was the kind of backroom deal that kept suburban politics functioning smoothly. It was also exactly the kind of corruption that Jake Morrison had spent his military career fighting against. Commissioner, I appreciate your call, but I think the legal process should run its course. There was a long pause. Mr. Morrison, I hope you understand what you're choosing here. Margaret's concerns about you. Margaret Thornfield arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with the largest force she'd assembled yet. 6 county officials, 2 environmental inspectors, a representative from the state's agricultural department, and what appeared to be a private security consultant, carrying professional photography equipment. Jake watched from his kitchen window as they deployed across his property with military precision, each team targeting specific structures and areas. Margaret stood at the gate like a general directing, her troops, clipboard in hand and satisfaction written across her face. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush 3 days in the making. Jake's phone buzzed with a call from Sarah Chen. Are you seeing this circus? Front row seat. Jake, I filed the complaints with the State Attorney General and the FBI. Task force yesterday evening. They're very interested in the evidence you collected. How interested? Interested enough that Agent Rebecca Martinez from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit is driving down from the state capitol this morning. She wants to interview you and examine the Thornfield documents. Jake watched Margaret's inspection team fan out across his property, photographing and measuring everything with the thoroughness of people who believed they held all the cards. Tell Agent Martinez she might want to bring a photographer. Margaret's about to provide some excellent evidence of selective enforcement and official misconduct. Jake stepped onto his back porch and called out to the lead inspector. Morning, folks. Beautiful day for trespassing. Inspector Williams looked up from his clipboard. Mr. Morrison, we're conducting a follow-up compliance inspection pursuant to county code violations. We have legal authority to be here. Of course you do. Mind if I document your work for my attorney? Jake pulled out his phone and began recording, making sure to capture each inspector's face and the specific areas they were examining. Margaret noticed the recording and approached with the confidence of someone who believed the law was entirely on her side. Mr. Morrison, I hope you've reconsidered your position on community cooperation. Actually, I have. I've decided to be very cooperative with the proper authorities. Margaret's smile faltered slightly at his tone, but she pressed forward. Excellent. Then you'll be pleased to know we've expedited the process for bringing your property into compliance with county standards. That's interesting. Tell me, Mrs. Thornfield, are those the same county standards your HOA has been systematically violating for the past 5 years? The question hit Margaret like a slap. Her composure cracked for just a moment, revealing uncertainty beneath the authoritative facade. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Jake pulled out a folder of photographs and handed her the first one, a clear shot of the HOA's community center sitting on unpermitted land. Tell me about the permits for that building. Margaret stared at the photograph, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching panic. This building was properly approved through all appropriate channels. Really? Because the county recorder's office has no record of any permits for structures on that lot. In fact, the original subdivision plan specifically designates that area as protected green space. Inspector Williams had stopped his measurements and was walking toward them, drawn by the tension in Margaret's voice. Behind him, the other officials were slowing their work, sensing that something significant was happening. Jake handed Margaret another photograph, this one showing the parking lot that had been built over protected wetlands. What about environmental? Permits for paving over that creek watershed? That's not. The HOA followed all environmental guidelines. The same guidelines you're using to claim my farm pond is an environmental hazard? Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she held the photographs. The confident authority that had carried her through days of bureaucratic warfare was evaporating as she realized Jake hadn't spent the past week cowering from her threats. He'd been gathering ammunition to destroy her. Mrs. Thornfield, Inspector Williams said quietly, perhaps we should discuss these documents in private. But Jake wasn't finished. He handed Margaret the most damaging photograph of all, the drainage modifications on her own property that channeled runoff directly into the protected creek. And this is your house, isn't it? With the modified drainage system that violates the same environmental codes you're using against me? Margaret dropped the photographs. For the first time since this conflict began, she was speechless. A black sedan pulled into Jake's driveway, and FBI agent Rebecca Martinez stepped out, a professional woman in her 40s whose bearing suggested extensive experience with public corruption cases. She surveyed the scene with the analytical gaze of someone trained to recognize criminal behavior in bureaucratic settings. Mr. Morrison? She approached with her credentials already visible. Agent Martinez, FBI, I believe you have some information relevant to our investigation. The effect on Margaret's inspection team was immediate and dramatic. County officials who had been aggressively documenting violations suddenly found reasons to pack up their equipment. The agricultural inspector was already loading his vehicle, while the environmental team had gathered into a nervous huddle near the gate. Margaret herself looked like she was seeing her entire world collapse in real time. Agent Martinez, Jake said. Perfect timing. Mrs. Thornfield was just explaining how her HOA obtained permits for their community center. Agent Martinez turned her attention to Margaret, whose face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Mrs. Thornfield? I'm conducting an investigation into potential violations of federal laws regarding abuse of public authority. I'd like to ask you some questions. I need to call my attorney. That's certainly your right. But I should mention that we've received reports of systematic permit fraud, environmental violations, and possible extortion involving county officials. Your cooperation could be very helpful in resolving these matters." Inspector Williams stepped forward, clearly trying to salvage what remained of the official inspection. "Agent Martinez, we're conducting routine code enforcement here. There's no need for federal involvement." "Mr. Williams, isn't it?" Agent Martinez consulted her notes. "You've been involved in several unusual inspection processes recently, all targeting the same property owner who filed complaints about HOA harassment. That seems like an interesting pattern?" Williams looked at Margaret, then at the other county officials, then back at Agent Martinez. Jake could almost see him calculating whether his county job was worth potential federal charges. Perhaps we should postpone this inspection pending further review of procedures." "Excellent idea," Agent Martinez said smoothly. "Mr. Morrison, could we discuss those documents you mentioned in your complaint?" Jake led Agent Martinez toward the house, but paused to address Margaret one final time. "Mrs. Thornfield, you mentioned earlier that you hoped I'd reconsidered my position on community cooperation. Well, I have. I've decided to cooperate fully with federal investigators looking into public corruption and environmental crimes." Margaret stood frozen near the gate, surrounded by the remains of her inspection team and the wreckage of her carefully constructed campaign against Jake's property. The authority she'd wielded so confidently for days had evaporated the moment FBI credentials appeared. But Jake could see in her eyes that she wasn't defeated. Not yet. Margaret Thornfield was the kind of person who would fight until the very end, using whatever weapons remained available to her. Inside the house, Agent Martinez spread Jake's documentation across the kitchen table with the methodical precision of someone building a federal case. "Mr. Morrison, this is exactly the kind of systematic corruption we see when local officials abuse their authority for personal gain." "How strong is the case?" "Strong enough to trigger a grand jury investigation if the evidence supports your claims. The combination of permit fraud, environmental violations, and official misconduct creates a pattern that suggests criminal conspiracy." Jake's phone rang. Sarah Chen. "Jake, you need to see the news. Channel 7 is running a story about HOA corruption in county government. Someone leaked the story about Margaret's inspection campaign and her husband's political connections." Agent Martinez looked up from the documents. "That would be us. We often work with media partners when public corruption cases have significant community impact." Through the kitchen window, Jake could see Margaret standing beside her car, talking rapidly on her phone while gesturing toward the house. Whatever she was saying, it involved animated hand movements and what appeared to be shouting. "Agent Martinez, what happens to the county officials who were involved in the illegal inspections?" "Depends on their level of cooperation with our investigation. The ones who were just following orders might face administrative discipline. The ones who actively participated in the conspiracy could face federal charges." Jake watched Inspector Williams loading his equipment with the defeated posture of someone whose career had just taken a fatal hit. Margaret was still on her phone, but now she was pacing back and forth like a caged animal looking for an escape route. "There's something else," Agent Martinez said, pulling out another file. "Your property isn't the only one the Thornfields have targeted. We've found—" Jake woke to the sound of his smoke detector screaming and the orange glow of flames visible through his bedroom window. He rolled out of bed with the muscle memory of someone who'd responded to countless emergency situations, grabbing his phone, and boots while assessing the tactical situation through years of combat experience. The chicken coop was engulfed in flames. Jake dialed 911 while pulling on clothes, his mind already calculating response times and damage control. The volunteer fire department was 12 minutes away on a good day, and this wasn't a good day. The autumn drought had left everything tinder dry and vulnerable to rapid fire spread. 911, what's your emergency? Structure fire at 1247 County Road 18. Chicken coop fully involved, flames spreading toward residential structure. Jake ran outside with a garden hose, knowing it was inadequate but needing to do something while waiting for professional help. The heat hit him like a physical wall as he approached the burning building, the corrugated metal roof already collapsing into the interior where his 16 hens had been roosting for the night. All 16 birds were dead. The flames were too intense for rescue, too widespread for his garden hose to make any difference. Jake could only watch as 3 years of careful construction and gentle animal husbandry turned into smoke and ash. At the pond, his geese were in full alarm mode, honking frantically and swimming in agitated circles while the fire reflected off the water like a scene from hell. Hannibal stood at the water's edge, with his wings spread and neck extended, ready to defend his flock against the encroaching flames. Fire trucks arrived 8 minutes later, their sirens cutting through the night as volunteer firefighters deployed. Hoses and foam to contain the blaze. By then, the coop was a total loss, but they managed to prevent the fire from spreading to Jake's house or the surrounding woods. Fire Chief Tommy Rodriguez approached Jake as the last flames were extinguished, his expression grim beneath his helmet. "Jake, I'm sorry about your birds. Any idea how this started?" Jake stared at the smoldering ruins of his chicken coop, noting details that most people would miss. The fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, not the pattern of an electrical short or overheated heat lamp, but the signature of deliberate arson. "Tommy, I need you to call the state fire marshal. This wasn't an accident." "What makes you say that?" Jake pointed to the burn patterns visible in the wreckage. Multiple ignition points, accelerant splash patterns on the exterior walls, and the timing. Right after I became the key witness in a federal corruption investigation. Tommy followed Jake's gaze, his expression shifting from sympathy to professional concern. "You think someone torched your coop?" "I think someone just escalated from bureaucratic harassment to criminal intimidation." Jake's phone rang at 6 a.m. "Agent Martinez." "Mr. Morrison, I heard about the fire. Are you all right?" "I'm fine. My chickens aren't." "The state fire marshal is en route. We're treating this as a potential arson connected to the federal investigation." "Any chance it was just coincidental?" "Mr. Morrison, in 20 years of investigating public corruption, I've learned that there are no coincidences when federal witnesses start having mysterious accidents." Jake walked through the ruins of his coop while talking, photographing evidence for what was now both an insurance claim and a criminal investigation. The accelerant residue was visible to anyone. Who knew what to look for? Splash patterns on the exterior walls that indicated gasoline or another petroleum-based accelerant. "Agent Martinez, how long before your investigation produces arrests?" "Federal cases take time to build properly. We're looking at months, possibly a year before indictments come down." "A year is a long time for a witness to stay healthy in a small county where the sheriff's department reports to people who want that witness dead." There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Morrison, are you saying you don't trust local law enforcement to protect you?" Jake laughed bitterly. "Agent Martinez, the sheriff who responds to crimes in this county, was elected with campaign contributions from David Thornfield. The fire chief who investigated suspicious fires reports to a county commission that David Thornfield chairs. I'm not saying they're all corrupt, but I'm not betting my life on their objectivity either. We can arrange federal protection. I don't need protection. I need justice." After Agent Martinez hung up, Jake walked to his pond, where his geese were still agitated from the night's excitement. Hannibal approached cautiously, sensing Jake's mood and offering the kind of wordless comfort that only animals understood. "It's okay, soldier," Jake said quietly, running his hand along the goose's neck. "They killed the chickens, but they made a mistake. They showed me exactly what kind of people we're dealing with." Jake's phone buzzed with a text from the now familiar unknown number. "Sorry about your birds, Morrison. Accidents happen when people don't cooperate with community standards. More accidents possible if you keep causing problems." Jake forwarded the message to Agent Martinez, then deleted it from his phone. Margaret Thornfield had just committed federal witness intimidation in writing, a crime that carried up to 20 years in prison. She was digging her own grave one text message at a time. At noon, Jake drove to the county sheriff's office to file a formal complaint about the arson and the threatening messages. Sheriff Robert Hayes was a political appointee who'd held his position for 8 years through careful alignment with county commissioners and HOA interests. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Hayes said without warmth, "I understand you've been having some difficulties with your neighbors." "I've been having difficulties with arsonists and extortionists. My neighbors are fine." Now let's not jump to conclusions about the fire. Could have been an electrical short, faulty wiring, any number of things. Jake placed printouts of the threatening text messages on the sheriff's desk. "What about these?" Sheriff Hayes glanced at the messages without really reading them. "Looks like someone expressing frustration with property maintenance issues. Hardly criminal behavior. Sheriff, someone burned down my chicken coop and then sent me a text message saying accidents happen when people don't cooperate. That's arson and witness intimidation." "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're upset about the fire, but making wild accusations about prominent community members isn't going to help resolve this situation." Jake leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to the tone that had once made Taliban commanders reconsider their life choices. "Sheriff, are you refusing to investigate credible threats against a federal witness?" "I'm suggesting that you might be letting your imagination run away with you. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. Old chicken coops catch fire, people get frustrated with property disputes, and coincidences happen." Jake stood and collected his evidence. "Sheriff, I want you to understand something clearly. When the FBI starts investigating everyone connected to this case, your refusal to investigate threats against me is going to be very interesting to them." Sheriff Hayes' expression hardened. "Mr. Morrison, I don't appreciate being threatened in my own office. I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you that your behavior as an elected official is being documented by federal investigators. What you do with that information is your choice." Jake left the sheriff's office with the absolute certainty that Margaret Thornfield's corruption had infected every level of county government. The fire had been intended to intimidate him into silence, but it had actually revealed the true scope of the criminal conspiracy he was fighting. That evening, Jake sat on his back porch with a beer and his laptop, researching everything he could find about Margaret's extended family and political connections. What he discovered made him understand that the chicken coop fire was just the opening move in what was about to become total warfare. Margaret's brother was a contractor who specialized in rural property development. Her sister worked for the county planning department. Her nephew was a volunteer firefighter who'd been conspicuously absent from the previous night's emergency response. The Thornfield family had spent years building a network of political and economic relationships that gave them unprecedented control over land use decisions in the county. Jake's resistance to their authority threatened not just Margaret's ego, but millions of dollars in planned development projects. People had been killed for much less. Jake's phone rang. Sarah Chen. "Jake, I've got bad news. Someone broke into my office last night and stole all the files related to your case." "Everything?" "Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence we'd gathered about HOA violations and permit fraud. They were very thorough, even took backup files from my locked cabinet." Jake felt the familiar cold clarity that came with being under direct enemy fire. Margaret Thornfield wasn't just escalating the conflict. She was preparing to destroy all evidence of her crimes while eliminating the witnesses who could testify against her. "Sarah, do you have copies stored somewhere else?" "Some of it, but not everything." "Jake, I think you need to consider that staying in the county might not be safe. These people have resources and connections we can't match." "I'm not running. This isn't about courage. It's about survival. They burned your chicken coop as a warning. What happens when they decide warnings aren't enough?" After Sarah hung up, Jake walked. Jake's counterattack began at dawn with a phone call that would destroy the Thornfield empire forever. Agent Martinez, I've got something that's going to make your day. What kind of something, Mr. Morrison? Jake smiled as he looked at his laptop screen, where hours of careful research had uncovered the smoking gun he'd been searching for. The kind that turns a corruption investigation into a RICO prosecution. 3 hours later, Agent Martinez sat in Jake's kitchen with a team of federal investigators staring at documentation that revealed the true scope of the Thornfield criminal conspiracy. Jake had spent the entire night cross-referencing property records, campaign contributions, and business licenses to create a comprehensive map of organized crime masquerading as suburban development. "My God," Agent Martinez whispered, "this isn't just corruption. It's a family criminal enterprise." Jake pointed to a series of property transfers on his laptop screen. Margaret's harassment campaign wasn't random. Every rural property she's targeted sits on land that her brother's development company wanted to acquire. The bureaucratic pressure was designed to force sales at below-market prices. How many properties are we talking about? 17 over the past 5 years, with a combined value of approximately $40 million. The pattern is identical. In every case, mysterious code violations, environmental citations, permit cancellations, and escalating pressure until the owners sold to Thornfield Development, LLC. Special Agent David Kim, a financial crimes specialist, looked up from the bank records Jake had somehow acquired. "Mr. Morrison, how did you obtain these internal banking documents?" "I may have mentioned to my banker that I was concerned about suspicious financial activity in the county. Turns out he was concerned too, especially after several rural property owners came to him for emergency loans to fight bogus county violations." Agent Martinez laughed, despite herself. "Mr. Morrison, you've just handed us enough evidence to indict the entire family under RICO statutes. This is organized criminal activity under color of official authority." It gets better. Jake opened another file on his laptop. Margaret's nephew, the volunteer firefighter who was mysteriously absent during my chicken coop fire. He's been involved in 7 accidental structure fires on rural properties over the past 3 years. All 7 properties were subsequently sold to Thornfield Development. The room fell silent as the investigators absorbed the implications. Margaret Thornfield wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. She was the operational commander of a criminal organization that used arson, extortion, and government corruption to steal millions of dollars in property. Agent Kim's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He answered, listened for a moment, then smiled with savage satisfaction. That was the surveillance team. Margaret Thornfield just walked into the county clerk's office with what appears to be forged documents attempting to retroactively justify the permit cancellations on your property. She's still trying to cover her tracks. She's still committing crimes while under federal surveillance. At this point, she's basically helping us build our case. Jake's phone rang. Sarah Chen, calling from her temporary office after the break-in. "Jake, something's happening at Willowbrook Heights. There are FBI vehicles everywhere, and residents are saying they're executing search warrants on multiple properties." Through his kitchen window, Jake could see black sedans and unmarked vans moving through the subdivision like a coordinated military operation. Margaret's criminal empire was being dismantled in real time by federal agents armed with the evidence Jake had provided. "How long before arrests?" Jake asked Agent Martinez. "Any minute now. We've got simultaneous warrants for Margaret, her husband, her brother, and 6 other conspirators. This is going to be the largest public corruption bust in state history." Jake walked onto his back porch and looked across his property toward the subdivision where Margaret had once commanded absolute authority. At the pond, his geese sensed the excitement and were swimming in agitated patterns while honking their approval of whatever was happening beyond the fence line. "Hannibal," Jake called out. "Come here, soldier." The big goose approached with curious confidence, followed by his 5 companions. Jake had been thinking about this moment since the night his chickens were murdered, planning the perfect ending to Margaret's reign of terror. "Agent Martinez," Jake called back toward the house. "I think Margaret might want to retrieve some evidence she left on my property yesterday." "What kind of evidence?" "The gasoline can she use to burn my chicken, co-op. I found it in the tall grass near my fence line this morning." Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway with a look of amazement. "You found physical evidence of the arson? Fingerprints, DNA, and probably security camera footage from the subdivision showing her carrying it onto my property." Jake pointed toward a small trail camera he'd mounted on a fence post 3 days ago. "I've been documenting everything since this started. Mr. Morrison, you've just provided the final piece of evidence we need to prosecute Margaret Thornfield for federal arson charges. Combined with the RICO violations, she's looking at potentially 30 years in federal prison." Jake's phone buzzed with a text message, but this time it wasn't from an unknown number. Margaret Thornfield was calling from her own phone, probably, in a panic as FBI agents seized her computers and arrested her co-conspirators. "Morrison, you have to stop this. My husband has political connections. We can make a deal." Jake showed the message to Agent Martinez, who photographed it as additional evidence of attempted obstruction of justice. "Should I respond?" Jake asked. "Tell her the time for deals ended when she murdered your chickens." Jake was typing his response when he heard shouting from the direction of the subdivision. Through the fence line, he could see Margaret Thornfield, running across the open field between her house and his property, apparently having escaped the FBI raid through her backyard. She was carrying something that looked suspiciously like a gasoline can. "Agent Martinez," Jake said calmly, "I think Margaret wants to have a conversation." Margaret crashed through Jake's fence line with the desperate fury of someone whose entire world was collapsing. Her perfect hair was disheveled. Her designer clothes were torn from running through woods, and her eyes held the wild desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You destroyed everything!" she screamed, raising the gasoline can like a weapon. 20 years of building this community, and you destroyed it all." Agent Martinez and her team were moving to intercept, but Jake held up a hand to stop them. He had a better idea. "Margaret," he said calmly, "you're trespassing." "I don't care about your stupid property lines anymore. You've ruined my life." Margaret started toward Jake with the gasoline can, but stopped abruptly when she heard the sound that had haunted her nightmares since their first encounter. Hannibal's territorial honk cut through the morning air like a battle cry. The massive goose launched himself from the pond with his wings spread wide and his neck extended in full attack mode. Behind him, the other 5 geese took flight in formation, creating the kind of aerial assault that had once driven Viking longships away from defended coastlines. Margaret's eyes went wide with terror as she remembered her last encounter with Jake's attack geese. She raised the gasoline can to defend herself, but Hannibal was already committed to his attack run. The goose hit Margaret's center mass with 20 pounds of feathered fury, driving her backward into the mud while the gasoline can flew from her hands. The other geese immediately joined the assault, surrounding her with a wall of wings and beaks and territorial rage that left no doubt about who controlled this particular piece of real estate. "Get them off me!" Margaret screamed from beneath the aggressive waterfowl. "Somebody help me!" "They're just defending their territory," Jake said calmly, echoing the words he'd used during their first encounter. "Can't say I blame them." Agent Martinez and her team moved in to arrest Margaret while the geese maintained their defensive perimeter. Hannibal honked once at the federal agents, seemed to recognize they were allies, and led his flock back toward the pond with the satisfied air of a job well done. Margaret Thornfield was handcuffed in the same mud where she'd fallen during her first encounter with Jake's geese, this time facing federal charges that would end her freedom for decades. "Margaret Thornfield," Agent Martinez said formally, "you're under arrest for racketeering, arson, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to commit fraud under color of official authority." As the FBI agents led Margaret away, She looked back at Jake with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Morrison. People like you don't win against people like us." Jake smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just achieved total victory against impossible odds. "Lady, people like me spent 24 years learning how to beat people exactly like you." 3 months later, Jake Morrison sat on his back porch, reading the newspaper coverage of the Thornfield trial verdicts. Margaret had been sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Her husband, David, received 18 years for his role in the conspiracy. Her brother got 15 years for arson and racketeering. The Willowbrook Heights HOA had been dissolved by court order, its assets seized to pay restitution to the 17 property owners who'd been victimized by